Okay, so we are studying Gemara Sota, and we've been jumping around a little bit. Today we're going to do some of Gemara Sota, and then there is a siyum, conclusion of a tractate that we'll conclude today's class with, which gives a evening a state of joy. We try to infuse the 9 days, which are 9 days of mourning. Today is the 2nd of Av, so we are in the 2nd of the 9 days. There's all sorts of things that we avoid doing because of the state of mourning that we are in. For example, we don't listen to music, live music for sure. We don't make any sort of celebrations during these days. The only celebration which is permitted during the 9 days is the celebration of a bris milah, because the other you're kind of stuck with whatever time you have. Say the celebration of bris milah, and any celebration which you can choose the time is done outside of the 9 days. We don't travel for unless it's essential. We don't take. See, in the times of Talmud says you don't bathe or shower. That's because bathing and showering was considered a luxurious act. Today, bathing and showering is more so seen as a necessary act of cleanliness. Nonetheless, it is still best to avoid a long shower or a hot shower. If you're doing it for necessity, then do it limited to the necessity. Anyway, so these are some of the laws of the 9 days. However, so in that sense, it's like mourning. It's like, God forbid, one has to sit Shiva. But there is a significant difference between when one sits Shiva, Lo Aleinu, and the 9 days of mourning. And that is that one of the prohibitions when one sits Shiva is that one is not allowed to study Torah, because Torah brings joy. And therefore, one is not supposed to study Shiva during a week of mourning. And the only Torah one is allowed to study when sitting Shiva is the laws connected to mourning. But during these 9 days, one is allowed to study Torah. And in fact, Torah is the one form of joy that one is allowed to pursue and one is encouraged to pursue. And it's the added joy when one completes a tractate of Talmud. Then there is great joy. And it's not just joyous for the one who makes the completion, but it's joyous for anyone present. So tonight, we had a siyum earlier today between Mincha and Ma'ariv, and tonight by 9 o'clock, we will merit to hear another siyum. And for that reason, we're actually serving a chalent with meat, because the siyum creates a festive mitzvah occasion, which would allow for one to enjoy meat. There's some more stringent regardless, but that's the permissibility of eating meat during the 9 days. Okay, but let's go back to our Gemara and study what I think is a pretty fascinating and very enlightening section of the Gemara. So it's Gemara Sota Daf Mem Amud Aleph. That's 40a, right in the middle of the page, and we're going to talk a little bit about humility. Humility is a big word. Be humble is an important quality. I think everyone agrees that humility is a quality, but what exactly does humility mean? What does it mean to be humble? So I think this Gemara shares some very valuable insights on what true humility is, because there's false humility and there's true humility. They say about the rabbi stands in front of the shul in the high holidays in Yom Kippur, and he turns to God and he says, "God in heaven, I am a nothing. I am just a nothing." The ultimate statement of humility. And the chazan standing next to the rabbi turns even louder voice and says, "God in heaven, let it be known that I'm an even greater nothing." All right. And from the back of the shul, there's someone, just, a schlepper who's there, who yells out, "God, I too am a nothing." So the rabbi turns to the chazan and says, "Look who thinks he's a nothing." So sometimes sometimes humility, and for that matter, false humility is the ultimate display of arrogance. And often that's the way it is. Often humility can be a display of arrogance. When someone is looking to be recognized as a humble person, then that usually is the opposite of humility. That's a form of arrogance. So what is humility? So let's look to the Gemara and an episode in the Gemara which perhaps sheds insight onto this important topic. The Gemara says, the Amar Rabbahu, the Gemara here shares about the wisdom of the great sage Rabbi Abahu. It says, Amar Rabbi Abahu said, Meiresh Hava Amina. Initially, I thought in Vasna'ana, Inusna'ana. He said, I used to think that I was a humble person. That's how I used to think. I used to think I was humble. But then, even the Chazina le, the Reb Abba Demin Aku, then when I saw the behavior of Rabbi Abba from the city of Aku, that's when I realized I was not humble. When I saw his humility, I realized that I had not reached true humility, and Rabbi Abba of Aku was the one who was truly humble. So the Gemara says, what was it? What was it about Rabbi Abba of Aku, the humility that he showed, that proved to Rabbi Abahu that Rabbi Abahu had not reached the true level of humility? Why is that? Because to give some context to this following explanation, in the olden days, the typical way that a Rosh Yeshiva would teach was that the Rebbe would get up. What Rebbe would actually, I think, would be sitting, and he would sit in his seat and teach Torah quietly, teach it quietly. Right next to the Rebbe was someone who was known as the Miturgaman, which was the one who was the Miturgaman literally means translator. What's that? The loud voice. So next to the teacher was a person with a loud voice. The Rebbe wouldn't have to strain himself. The Rebbe would say the Torah thought quietly, and the Miturgaman, the conveyor, perhaps let's just call that, the conveyor would then pass on the message to the people. And Rabbi Abahu, that is, noticed that Rabbi Abba would teach something, and he would say one thing, the Amar Ihu Chad Taima, he said, I noticed Rabbi Abba would give one explanation of the Talmud. The Omar Amore Chad Taima, and the translator or the conveyor, instead of conveying what Rabbi Abba taught, he gave his own idea, entirely different idea to the public. V'loi kopid, and he was not bothered by it. Amina lav inusna ana. When I saw that display of humility, I said, I am not a humble person. That takes true humility. The fact that he was teaching one thing, and the one who was conveying the message to the others was saying a different idea altogether. Says that's true humility. To be able to that disrespect, and that's when I realized I'm not truly a humble person. So the question is, what's so unique about that humility? You know, it seems to be a strange display of humility. So the Marsha comments on this and says, it can't be that the conveyor, the Miturgaman, was sharing ideas which were inappropriate. Because if he was sharing ideas which were inappropriate, then in other words, they were incorrect. If he was sharing ideas that are incorrect, then Rabbi Abba must have stopped him. Because you can't allow incorrect ideas to be taught to the masses. Even if you're not worried about your own respect, you can't permit incorrect ideas to be taught. So the Marsha explains it must be that the interpreter actually gave some nice ideas. It just wasn't his ideas. And because they were nice ideas, despite the fact that it wasn't his ideas, he was quiet and he let it go. He let it slide. And Rabbi Abahu said that is the epitome of humility, was that moment in time. I want to continue because the Gemara shares other circumstances of humility, and then we can kind of revisit the three different stories and how each one teaches us another lesson in humility. But the first example, again, is that he taught one thing quietly. The interpreter taught something entirely different, even though his job was to share what Rabbi Abba was teaching. And that is what proved to Rabbi Abahu that he had a long way to go in achieving true humility. Yeah.
I guess probably personal between humility and being treated poorly.
Right. And that's a great point, just to repeat for the people online. What's the line between humility and being treated poorly? It's a good question. And the answer is not always that clear. Because in this situation, you can argue Rabbi Abba is being treated poorly and disrespectfully. If he is hired to be the teacher, and not just the teacher, but the primary teacher of the primary yeshiva, and the person who's hired to simply convey his message is not doing his job, and he very easily could say, I want a new interpreter. He didn't say that. He allowed, because he felt that even though he's not teaching what I said to be taught, because he is sharing ideas that I think are valuable, even though it's not the ones I was hoping to teach, he let it slide. But you're right, that he was being treated improperly. There has to be an element of self-respect, and in this situation, he seemed to compromise even self-respect.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's see how the Gemara continues. The Gemara says, the Gemara now goes back for a moment and says, the opening statement was that Rabbi Abahu said, initially, I thought I was humble. And now I learned from Rabbi Abba that I've yet to reach true humility. Now the Gemara says, why did Rabbi Abahu think that he was humble? In other words, what merit did he have? What example would he give that made him think that he was humble until he saw the greater humility of Rabbi Abba? So what was the humility of Rabbi Abba? That's the Gemara's question. The Gemara says, Umay in vasnuse de Rabbi Abba. What exactly is the humility of Rabbi Abba that caused him to, that made him initially say, I am humble? So as it turns out, that it was a similar story to the one with Rabbi Abba, but with a slight difference. The Amri la dvisu the Amoyre de Rabbi Abahu, Lidvise de Rabbi Abahu, the wife of the interpreter of Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba was also a Rosh Yeshiva. And as a Rosh Yeshiva, he also had an interpreter. Again, the interpreter over here means the person who stood next to him to convey his messaging. So the wife of the interpreter had the following conversation with the wife of Rabbi Abba, in which she said to him, Hadidan loy tzarech le'lididach. She said, hope you're following the people over here, right? The wife of the interpreter is having a conversation with the wife of Rabbi Shiva. And the wife of the interpreter says, mine doesn't need yours. Mine doesn't need yours. Yeah. Firstly, this tells you who belongs to who. She said mine. The husband, which is mine, my belonging, mine doesn't need yours. So, in other words, she was saying is that even though my husband is the interpreter to your husband, and you may think that my husband needs your husband's wisdom, which he then conveys to the yeshiva, that's not the case. My husband doesn't need your husband's wisdom. So then why is he the Meturgaman? And she said, V'hai degachin v'zakif alei. So why is he, literally means, why does he bend down and stand up? Because the way the process worked is that you'd have someone teaching, and you'd have the interpreter would be bending down to listen, and then standing up and sharing. Bending down to listen, standing up and sharing. So she said, again, the wife of the interpreter says, so if my husband doesn't need your husband's help, in other words, if he could be the one giving the lecture himself, so why is he bending down and listening to your husband if he could be giving the lecture himself? Is Yikara ba'almahu de'avid. He is just showing respect. He's just showing respect. Why would he show respect? So he says, actually Rashi reads, so one way you could say is he's showing respect. But if you look in Rashi has a different version of the wording in the Mishnah. He says, Yikara de Malchusa, respect for the king. Why? Because as the Rashi points out, that in the Gemara Chagiga, it talks about how Rabbi Abahu gained favor in the Bei Kesar, in the by the Caesar. The Caesar over here. This is during the era of the Roman control of the Roman control of Judea, and therefore you had some times where the Jewish people were very much dependent on the Romans. They were subjugated to them, and some sages we find gained favor in the eyes of the Romans. Like, for example, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Yehuda Hanasi wrote the Mishnah, became close with one of the Roman, what is it called? procurators. I forgot the exact word. One of the Roman authorities in the area. What's that? So the exarch was the same idea where the Romans established a leader. So apparently Rabbi Abahu was found favor in the eyes of the Caesars. In Gemara Sanhedrin, it says that when Rabbi Abahu would visit the Caesar's home, the matrons of the household would greet him and would say, "Prince of his people, leader of his nation." So Rabbi Abahu apparently gained favor in the Roman house, in the house of the Roman leadership. And therefore the interpreter's wife told Rabbi Abahu's wife, the truth is my husband should be the one giving the lecture. The only reason he's leaning down and saying otherwise, and leaning down and listening to your husband, is because your husband is well respected by the Romans, and therefore he has to show respect to him. So that's what she told his wife. Ozla Dvisu. So as a good wife, she went to Amr le Rabbi Abahu, and she told her husband, if you want to know, the interpreter who's interpreting your thing, if you want to know how they really feel, what they really feel is that he should be the one teaching the class, not you. I don't know if anybody over here feels that way right now, but that's the way he feels. So what is his answer? His answer is so profound. This answer to me shares the essence of humility. The answer that he told his wife. His wife was upset. His wife was offended. To what? So what did she answer? What did he answer his wife? He said, Amar Allah, he said to her, Umay nafka lech mina. What difference does it make to you? Why does this bother you so much? Mini umine yiskales ila'a. Through me and through him, let the one above be praised. And I think that's his answer. I think the answer is very beautiful. You would think that perhaps, you would think that perhaps, the humblest answer would be the definition. The humblest answer of someone to tell, again, today's way of thinking when it comes to humility, that if someone were to say, suppose the wife were to come to her husband and say, she thinks that her husband is better than you. So perhaps the humblest answer would be, maybe she's right. Maybe she's right. Maybe he is better than me. That's not really the Jewish definition of humility. That's not essential. Maybe it's a form of humility. That's not the essence of humility. The essence of humility from the Jewish standpoint is, who cares? Who cares about me? Who cares about him? I don't matter and he doesn't matter. The question is the name of God being sanctified through us? And if the answer is yes, I don't care what he thinks. I don't care how I think. I don't care what he thinks. And to me, this is this story and those words capture. When I read it, I said, this is something that's going to stick with me. It captures the essence of humility. Often when we think of humility, we think of how I think of myself. Do I think of myself better? Or do I think of myself worse? Worse. Do I take credit? Do I not take credit? At the core of humility is simply not concerned about myself. It's not that I think I'm great or that I think I'm poor. It's simply that I don't think about myself. I once heard a line, which is an English line, which I think captures this idea as well. And that is that humility is not thinking less of oneself. Humility is thinking of oneself less. And there's a very big difference between that. Most people think humility is thinking less of oneself. Don't think that great. You're not that great. Think less of yourself. Don't think you're all that and more. Rather, stop thinking about yourself. And that's the point over here. He says to his wife, why does it bother you what he says? All that matters is that with me and him together, we're sharing the word of Hashem. That God's name is being elevated by the two of us teaching Torah. And we find a very similar story with regards to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah, at the end of the Torah portion, Ba'aloscha, Moshe is also described as the humblest person, right? Moshe, the Torah tells us a few times, Moshe Rabbeinu is anav me'od mikol adam, more humble than any person. So the question is, what does that mean? Moshe Rabbeinu is also, the Torah in the same breath says he was also the greatest prophet ever. So often how I'll pose the questions like this. If you were to talk to Moshe Rabbeinu and you were to ask Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the greatest prophet in the world? You know what his answer would be? Me. It's true, because Moshe was a man of truth. Humility is not being dishonest. That's humility. Dishonesty is not humility. Dishonesty is, in fact, dishonesty is a sin. And as if I'm dishonest, if I'm dishonest about my qualities, then that's sinful. Who am I offending when I'm dishonest about my qualities? I'm offending God. God gave me a gift. God gave me certain qualities, and I'm going to deny that. I'm not hurting. I'm denying God. It's an affront to God to deny a gift that God gives me. So if you were to ask Moshe Rabbeinu, who the Torah says is the humblest person of his time, ask him who's the greatest prophet today, he'd say me. But he'd say it has nothing to do with me. It's not my achievement. It's not my achievement. But more importantly, whether it's my achievement or not, the question of a humble person is, who cares about me? The question is, who cares about me? Who cares whether I am great, I'm not great? The question is God's name being sanctified? And if the answer is yes, then I'm doing my job. Then it doesn't matter how people think of me. It doesn't really matter how I think about myself. And so what happens in the end of the Torah portion of Ma'aloscha is that Moshe Rabbeinu designates, Moshe Rabbeinu complains to God and says, God, I can't handle the Jewish people on my own. I need help. So God says, okay, I'll let you select 70 elders and they will become prophets. 70 elders, and you will give you should give from your wisdom to them, and then as soon as you convey your wisdom to them, they will then ascend to a level of prophecy. And that's what happens. So you have 70 prophets. And then what happens next? It says there were 70 people gathered as the elders, as the prophets, and then there's 2 people in the Machana, 2 people who were not chosen as the 70, and they too are prophesizing. And their names are Eldad and Medad. Eldad and Medad misnavim Machana. 2 people not part of the 70 that Moshe chose, and they're prophesying. They're also prophets. Who gets upset? Yehoshua. Yehoshua is Moshe's right-hand man. He's worried about the dignity of his teacher, and he runs to Moshe, and he says, there's 2 people out there who you didn't choose, and they're also speaking words of prophecy. Should I get rid of them? Out of respect for Moshe, I get rid of them. And what's Moshe's answer? Moshe's answer is, Umi yitain. Why does this bother you? Shouldn't it be, Shekol ha'am neviim? Let the entire nation be prophets. Let the entire nation speak word of Hashem. And this conveys the same idea. He says, why are you worried for my honor? Who cares about my honor? Who cares if these are not the people I chose? The fact is, they're speaking words of prophecy, words of holiness. They're elevating the name of Hashem. So then I'm happy. Let the entire nation. I don't need the honor. It's not about me. It's about the name of Hashem being honored. And this is what Rabbi Abba told his wife. He said, it doesn't matter to me what they think of me. It's not, what matters to me is that through me and this person, Yiskala Sila, the name of God is being sanctified. Okay, that's one story. Now, despite this, so that story is what caused Rabbi Abahu to say about himself that he was humble. But then he realized that even though he's humble, he hasn't reached true humility, because Rabbi Abba reached a higher level of humility because of the story we said earlier. Why is Rabbi Abba's humility greater than Rabbi Abba? Again, the story of Rabbi Abba was also had to do with the interpreter, but he said one thing and the interpreter said something else, as opposed to the story of Rabbi Abahu where their wives had this conversation. The difference is this, is that in Rabbi Abahu's case, the interpreter was actually sharing the words of Rabbi Abahu. It's just his wife said he doesn't need to be doing that. In the case of Rabbi Abba, not to be confused with Abahu, in the case of Rabbi Abba, it was right in his face. To be able to, in his face, he said one thing, and the interpreter gave a different shot, gave a different explanation, and to be able to swallow your pride when literally in your face, this goes back to what you said earlier, where it's almost a form of, you have to have self-respect. If I'm saying one thing and the interpreter is saying something in front of my face, saying something entirely different, and despite the fact he swallowed his pride and said, and allowed it to continue, Rabbi Abahu felt that is a higher degree of humility that he had yet to reach. And that's what tells you that when it comes to humility, the hardest form of humility is when it's something right in front of you, literally where the person right in front of you is a situation which is somewhat disrespectful, and to be able to swallow one's pride, even if it's right there in front of you, that's a higher level of humility. Yeah. What would there is an issue of navigation moment, but I'm not sure what you say about Lashon Hara and Rechilos. About where would you have to choose between humility and the violation of Lashon Hara?
Giving over the story. You're saying, did you hear about so-and-so saying about so-and-so for me? And like, whatever, you're not allowed to believe that. And if you're giving over the story and saying, this is what somebody said about me, and this is why I'm humble, isn't that in itself?
A form of Lashon Hara. Firstly, he didn't say that. He's not the one who shared that story. The Gemara shares the story. The Gemara shares why did Rabbi Abba, what's an illustration of Rabbi Abba's humility, and it shares that story about his wife, about the wives of the two people. Now, your question as to whether the wife of Rabbi Abba should have shared that information with her husband, which she heard from the interpreter's wife, was that a form of Lashon Hara? Good question. Maybe she felt that what would be the justification of her sharing that story with her husband? Lashon Hara applies between husbands and wives as well. You know, some people think that there's somehow some sort of loophole that if it's a husband or wife, you're allowed to share Lashon Hara. I don't know. In like, for example, in today's laws, HIPAA, is the spouse allowed to share if they know something? Probably not, right? The laws of HIPAA, I'm sure, apply to family as well. So if the laws of HIPAA, if something which is medically or legally confidential, if you're not allowed to share with your spouse, then we can appreciate the fact Lashon Hara you're also not allowed to share with your spouse. That being said, why would she? So you can argue. One argument can be made is that she shouldn't have shared that. Now the Talmud doesn't share any names. It's not like the Talmud tells us who the interpreter was or who the wife was. We don't know any names. So in that sense, we're protected. The Gemara is protecting us from Lashon Hara. But perhaps it can be said that the reason she shared it with her husband was because if her husband's right-hand man, is everything okay? Yeah. If her husband's right-hand man, the person he's trusting, doesn't really believe in him. Like imagine if let's just give an example. You have a president and a vice president. Suppose the vice president's wife, although today the vice president has a husband, right? But all right, so suppose that just for simplicity's sake. Suppose the vice president's wife told the president's wife that you should know the vice president really doesn't respect the president. So at that point, would it be justified for her then to share that with the president? I think the answer is yes, because this person is your confidant, person you trust and you rely upon. If you know that the person your spouse relies upon is not really respecting them, then that may be something which is okay to share just to protect them and protect what they're doing, especially in this case where they're teaching Torah. So I don't know if that was what you were referring to, but the fact that the wife shared that information with her husband perhaps can be justified along those lines. Okay. But the Gemara continues and says that's only one story of Rabbi Abba's humility. And now we'll come across another story of Rabbi Abba's humility. And this is perhaps what we would call more classic humility. And that is like this. It so happened, another story is like this. Rabbi Abahu, who we're talking about, Imnu Rabbanan alei limimne beresha. The sages appointed him to be the head of the yeshiva. So Rabbi Abahu was appointed to be the head of the yeshiva. Kivan de Chazye l'Rav Abba de min Aku de nefishi le bale chavos. When he noticed that Rabbi Abba of Aku was severely in debt, Amaluhu, he said to him, Ika Rabba, there's a better candidate than me, and that's Rabbi Abba of Aku. So Rabbi Abahu was chosen to be the head of the academy, but he knew that Rabbi Abba needed the job because he was in debt, and therefore he said, don't choose me to be the head of the academy, choose Rabbi Abba of Aku to be the head of the academy. What's that? So is that humility or is that kindness? That's a good question. I think it's a combination of both. It's kindness, but let's remember the ability to be the head of the academy is a job of great prestige. And by the way, how does that resolve his debt? So the answer is Rashi points out that in those days they would pay a significant amount to the head of the academy, so it would be a more respectable position. In other words, the head of the yeshiva academy, the Rosh Yeshiva was given an extra amount because they felt that this way this person would earn respect. If a person is a pauper, and they wouldn't have the proper respect. So therefore, he knew that if Rav Abba de min Aku would be chosen, he would be compensated for that, and he'd be able to pay off his debt. So you're right, Seth, to your point. That's a combination of kindness, but also humility, because he turned down a very prestigious position out of the kindness of helping someone else who was in a state of financial need. Gemara continues. Rabbi Abahu, continuing along these lines of the humility of Rabbi Abahu. Again, even though this same Rabbi Abahu said, I learned from Rabbi Abba that I'm not humble, but the Gemara continues to say the different stories of Rabbi Abahu's humility. Rabbi Abahu v'Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Abahu was traveling once with Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Iklau lahahu asra. By the way, I'm sorry, I wanted to just point out for a moment that in the previous story, you have something to share? No, these are Amoraim. I believe these are Amoraim. Yeah. I believe this is in the Arab Amoraim. Yeah. So he was traveling to Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Well, before I get to this, the Maharsha on the previous Gemara shares an interesting thing. And he says that two problems with leadership, which he says are common. Nowadays, he says it used to be, Maharsha is Shmuel Edels. He lived, I don't know, maybe 500 years ago. And he shares the following. First thing he says is, in the olden days, somebody who didn't need leadership for Parnasa reasons, somebody who was well-to-do or who had Parnasa, ran away from leadership because they saw leadership as a yoke and they weren't looking for that position. Different it is than nowadays, says the Maharsha, Shemishi yesh lo osher, that those who are wealthy are the ones who are running after leadership, running for the honor. And he says that's one of the differences between nowadays and previous days. Previous days, based on this Gemara, that Rabbi Abahu handed the leadership over to Rabbi Abba who needed it for financial reasons. He says nowadays, so he says it used to be that if you didn't need leadership, in other words, if you are able to support yourself, you ran away from leadership. Nowadays, those who are wealthy run toward leadership. That's the first thing he says. And the second thing he says about this Gemara, another difference between, as he says, it used to be and nowadays, is that nowadays, who appoints the leaders? He says those who appoint the leaders today are the balabatim, are the workers. And who do they appoint? They appoint a person who they feel will make lives comfortable for them. In other words, when you have the balabatim, those who are basically, he's saying that the people appointing the leaders should not be the people who will then be led. Because if it is the community of business people, so to say, who appoint the leader, then they will choose someone who they know will go easy on them. And therefore, he says, who should be choosing the leaders? If you see in the story in the Gemara, who chose the leader? Rabbi Abahu chose the leader. Another one, the sages chose the leader who would then be the leader of the community. Because then you know that the leader who will be chosen will be worthy, and one who will be honest, and one who will actually direct the community as they should be directed. So that's the Maharsha says two issues in leadership. He laments the fact, two issues. One is that nowadays, he says, there are people running after leadership, as opposed to the old days when people ran from leadership. And the second difference, he says, who's appointing the leaders? Nowadays, the congregation appoints the leaders, and therefore, inevitably, they're going to try to appoint someone who's going to be soft and easy on them, and keep them and not push them in to any form of discomfort, as opposed to the olden days that the sages chose the leaders, and then they would choose someone whose only agenda was to direct the people in the ways of Hashem. Okay. Now, the Gemara continues another episode with Rabbi Abahu, which indicates his humility. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Abahu was traveling with Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Iklo lahu asra. They arrived in a city, and both Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Chia went to give a class. They both went to give a lecture. Rabbi Abahu darash b'shmaita. I'm sorry, Rabbi Abahu darash b'agadata. Rabbi Abahu taught Agadata. Agadata is the stories of the Torah, the fascinating, interesting stories, the Agada. Rabbi Chia bar Abba darash b'shmaita. Rabbi Chia bar Abba gave a class on halacha, Jewish law. Which class do you think was more popular? The class with stories and fascinating ideas, or the stories about law? Stories. That's exactly what happened. Says the Gemara. The entire congregation left Rabbi Chia's class, which was about halacha, and they went to Rabbi Abba's class. This is not easy. How do you handle that situation? So they left Rabbi Chia's class, which was teaching them law, and they moved into Rabbi Abba's class next door. You can imagine some of these slipped out one at a time, and they made it to Rabbi Abba's class, which was stories of the Gemara, like we're sharing tonight. Cholash daite. As you can imagine, Rabbi Chia bar Abba was really upset. Amarle, so how did Rabbi Abahu appease his friend? What do you tell your friend when your class is the much more popular class? Amarle, he responded to him, he says, Em shalach mashal. I'll give you a parable to explain why this happened. Mashal, what could this be compared to? L'shnei bnei Adam, two people come to town. Echad moicher avanim toivos. One is selling diamonds. The echad moicher mine sidkius. And one of them is selling small wares, tchotchkes, pins, and spoons and forks, household items. Almi koifts. Which of the stores or which of the peddlers do you think is going to have more people lined up? He says no. The tchotchkes. Says if you go to the marketplace, there's the person selling all the different dollar items for $1 or $2. The diamonds, the fancy. There's going to be people. You have a person who come over, take a look, spend time, maybe buy something, maybe not. But it's the tchotchke store, it's the dollar store. That's the store people go to. He says to him, he says, that's the story here. He says, why? Because one's cheaper, it's easier. All you need is $1 to buy this item. You need $5, you can walk away. To get the diamonds, you really have to invest. He says the same is true over here. And I don't know. It's interesting to think if Rabbi Abba is just saying this to appease him, or maybe there's truth to it. That often the class which is less popular is because it requires more work and it's more valuable. And therefore he's saying your class is halacha. The class you give is halacha, is law, which requires concentration. The person has to take notes. If you're going to learn a halacha class properly, you have to take notes so you know exactly what you're going to do. You walk away with something very valuable. The class I'm giving may be inspiring or maybe interesting and inspiring, but it's cheap, it's easier. Both are Torah. Don't get me wrong. I would never call Torah, any part of Torah, something cheap for this. But he's saying the fact that there's less people is not an indication that this is that what I'm doing is better. What I'm giving is better. It could be the opposite. Because you're providing something so valuable, that's why people come to me, because what I'm selling is cheap and easy compared to what you're selling. That was a very fascinating response, and that's what he told him. But that wasn't enough. Apparently, Rabbi Chia bar Abba was still upset. He wasn't completely appeased. And as a further act to appease his friend, until that point, every evening, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, again, the one who had few people at his class, would escort Rabbi Abba to his house. In other words, when they went home at night, Chia bar Abba would make sure to walk Rabbi Abba home. Why? Because we said earlier, because Rabbi Abahu had the royalty to him, because the Caesar considered him to be an honored guest. So Chia bar Abba showed honor to Rabbi Abahu. However, that night, that day, Rabbi Akiva switched things up. Rabbi Abahu, because he felt that his friend was offended, because his class wasn't well attended, he said, I'll walk you to your house out of respect for you. And that's what he did. But the Gemara concludes, Vafilu hachi, but nonetheless, Chia bar Abba was not appeased by this. So these stories indicate the humility of Rabbi Abba. But the last point, which says that Rabbi Chia bar Abba was not appeased, you may ask, was maybe Rabbi Chia bar Abba out of place by being so offended that people weren't at his class. So the commentator said Rebbe Rabba was one of the great sages, but he was hurt because he was bothered by the fact that his Torah class wasn't good enough. He took it as a personal. He wasn't jealous. This wasn't coming from a place of jealousy. This is not that he was jealous of his friend Rebbe, but rather he felt that he felt that it was a sign that his Torah class wasn't good enough, and that's why he was upset that people weren't at his Torah shir. Okay, I want to continue one more, just because we have a few more minutes until Dr. Brenner comes and makes the siyum. Is Dr. Brenner here? No, okay. I told him 9 o'clock. So we have a few more minutes. So let's continue. Anyways, this is the Gemara, which shares about the lessons of humility, which I think are very practical lessons, and that we can take away as to what humility really means and what it means to be a good friend, and from the lessons both of Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Abba. Getting back to the Gemara here is talking about davening. So the following, the Gemara says, is this. Part of the davening is something we know is called Chazaras Hashat, the repetition of the Amidah. When the Chazan repeats the Shmona Esrei. Throughout most of the Shmona Esrei, as the Chazan repeats it, we are silent, with the exception of two parts. Right? There's 2 points in the repetition in which we speak up. One is Kedusha, in the beginning of the Amidah, and the other is Modim, at the end. When the Chazan says the Modim, we all say the Modim, what we call the Modim D'Rabbanan. The source of the Modim D'Rabbanan, which we say, is from this Gemara. Says the Gemara, Bizman sheshliach tzibur amar Modim, when the Chazan says Modim, ha'am mahim omrim, what should the congregation say? When the Chazan is saying Modim, what should we be saying? Amar Rav. So Rav said, here is what the Chazan should say. Modim anach, this is what the congregation should say. Modim anachnu lecha, lach, Hashem Elokeinu. We are thankful to you, God. Al she'anu modim lach. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Al she'anu modim lach. Modim anachnu lach, al she'anu modim lach. So we say that, yes, it's the beginning and the end of the D'Rabbanan modim. But what does it mean? What does it mean, modim al she'anu modim lach? We say it in the Siddur. I'm hooked up over here. Here we go. Modim anachnu lach, which means we are thankful. Al she'anu modim lach, which means literally, modim anachnu lach, we are thankful. Al she'anu modim lach, because we are thankful for being thankful. That's what it means. What does that mean? We are thankful for being thankful. So actually, there's a very profound idea being shared, which we say every day, twice a day. At least if you daven with a minyan, and we say these words, and the Shabbos as well. Modim anachnu lach, al she'anu modim lach conveys a very profound idea, and that is we thank God for inspiring us to appreciate God. So yes, we are thankful for being thankful. We thank you, God, for giving us the wisdom to be thankful to you. So thank you for giving us the wisdom to say thank you. Because if we are to extend this a little bit, there is no greater way to live than to live in a state of constant appreciation. There is no greater gift. There's no greater gift to yourself. Usually we think that if you're thankful, you're giving a gift to the person you're thankful to. If I'm thankful to my spouse, then I'm doing an act of kindness to them. If I'm thankful to whoever I'm thankful to, I'm doing an act of kindness to them. The truth is that when you're thankful, you're doing an act of kindness to yourself, because there is no happier way to live than to live than to live with gratitude. And so therefore, when we say modim anachnu lach, we thank you, God. Al she'anu modim lach. We thank you, God, for allowing us to be thankful. We're saying thank you, God, for giving us the wisdom to be thankful. And we say this every day in the Modim D'Rabbanan. So next time we say the Modim D'Rabbanan, you can remember this idea. Modim anachnu lach, which we say in the beginning, al she'anu modim lach, is thanking God for inspiring us to be thankful to God, because there's no greater gift than the inspiration of living a thankful life. All right, we'll stop here. And hopefully we'll give a quick shout out to Dr. Brenner, who can join us here and do the siyum in just a moment.
Thank you.